A central figure in the Wars of the Roses, Elizabeth Woodville, the White Queen, found herself on both the winning and losing sides, as the battle between the Yorkist supporters and the Lancastrians directly impacted not only her time as Queen Consort, but the fate of her two young sons, known as the Princes in the Tower. So let's take a deep dive into the life of Elizabeth Woodville, the White Queen. Elizabeth Woodville was born in 1437 in Northamptonshire, and was the eldest daughter of Richard Woodville, 1st Earl Rivers, and his wife, Jacquetta of Luxembourg. Whilst her father's family were respectable and wealthy, they were not of nobility, something which would prove to be an obstacle for Elizabeth's marriage to King Edward IV. Meanwhile, her mother was from an aristocratic family. She was also widow to John of Lancaster, Duke of Bedford, making her aunt to Henry VI. With such royal connections and lineage, Jacquetta was one of the most socially well-ranked women in England at the time. As a result, Jacquetta's marriage to Richard Woodville raised some eyebrows, as their marriage was not one of social equals. Nonetheless, the pair remained undeterred, and they married in secret, so as to avoid the necessary royal permissions required by Jacquetta to marry Woodville. As no such agreements had been reached, the couple received a hefty fine, and were only pardoned when Elizabeth was born. Elizabeth was noted for her beauty and was sure to have a long list of suitors, the first of which was John Grey, whom she married in 1452. The pair went on to have two sons together, before Sir John Grey tragically died in battle, killed at the Second Battle of St Albans in 1461, representing the House of Lancaster. Meanwhile, the Yorkist cause was growing more powerful, and Elizabeth soon found herself in a perilous social position, returning to live with her parents in Grafton while her husband's estates were seized by the Crown. Whether planned or by good fortune, Elizabeth's next steps saw her have the opportunity to plead her case directly to King Edward, who was hunting in the area. Known as a womanizer, Edward appeared to be quite taken by Elizabeth's notable beauty, and as a result embarked on a secret liaison, resulting in a clandestine marriage and the subsequent crowning ceremony on the 26th of May, 1465. Such a union rattled those in royal court. One person in particular who took great umbrage at the marriage was Earl of Warwick, also known as the Kingmaker. Warwick had been secretly arranging an alliance with the French, which would have seen Edward IV marry a French princess. Elizabeth's arrival on the scene scuppered his political plans and made her a resented figure in court. As soon as Elizabeth became queen, her family's status grew alongside Elizabeth's newly acquired power. In particular, her marriage proved very advantageous for her siblings and her children, angering those ambitious courtiers surrounding the monarch. To make matters worse, her father had been a Lancastrian, as was her deceased husband, leading many in the ruling House of York to find the marriage unacceptable. Nonetheless, Edward IV and his new queen went on to have 10 children, with 2 sons and 5 surviving daughters. The Yorkist line seemed secure enough. However, the rivalry was far from over. A deep divide emerged between Edward IV and the Earl of Warwick, prompting the Kingmaker to change sides. Elizabeth and her family's lack of favour led to an accusation of witchcraft, levelled against them by George, Duke of Clarence, the brother of Edward IV. In the end, Warwick and Clarence ended up conspiring together in revolt before fleeing to France. The ensuing conflict and Warwick's new alliance to the Lancastrian Queen Margaret of Anjou had a profound effect, particularly on Elizabeth, as both her father and brother were executed at the hands of Warwick in 1469, after the Battle of Edgecote. On the 3rd of October 1470, Edward IV was deposed in favour of Henry VI, Margaret's husband, who ascended the throne in his place. Edward and Elizabeth's exile proved temporary, however, as the following year Warwick faced defeat at the Battle of Barnet, leading to Henry VI's demise and the restoration of Edward to the throne on the 11th of April 1471. During their exile, Elizabeth had sought sanctuary in Westminster Abbey and had given birth to their son, Edward, the future monarch. With Edward IV once again king, Elizabeth's status was re-established. However, her position would soon come under scrutiny on the 9th of April 1483, Edward passed away, leaving Elizabeth a widow for the second time. Elizabeth was now incredibly vulnerable to outside forces, as there were those around her in court that had plans to usurp her and her son's right to be king. For a brief period, her son became Edward V. However, his uncle, Richard of Gloucester, the former king's younger brother, had other ideas. He seized the young King Edward, his half-brother Richard Grey, as well as Elizabeth's brother, Lord Rivers. Meanwhile, Elizabeth found sanctuary once again at Westminster Abbey, with her other young son, Richard, Duke of York. His security, however, was far from guaranteed, as his uncle, Richard, Duke of York, felt that the young prince also needed to be removed in order to guarantee his position as king. Thus, Elizabeth was forced to give up her son, who subsequently joined his brother in the Tower of London. With the two princes, Richard, Duke of York, and Edward, now technically Edward V, out of the way, Richard made his bid for the throne. In order to legitimise this takeover, he claimed that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth was bigamous, and therefore the two princes were illegitimate. Based on this rumour, Richard was rightfully king and was subsequently crowned King Richard III, leaving Elizabeth, the Dowager Queen, to be stripped of her lands and was now referred to as Dame Elizabeth Grey. The battle for the crown, however, was far from over. Whilst forced into sanctuary, Elizabeth was determined to restore the throne for her sons. This plan, however, fell apart after it was suspected, but never confirmed, that the princes in the tower were now dead. Having lost her two sons, who were presumed to have been murdered at the hands of their rival and uncle Richard III, Elizabeth was determined to oust Richard and remained politically active. She allied herself with Henry Stafford, Duke of Buckingham, previous ally to Richard III, and Margaret Beaufort, Henry Tudor's mother. Together they collaborated to ensure that Henry Tudor, the great-great-great-grandson of Edward III, would claim the throne. In order to do this, the two women agreed that uniting the families would bring an end to the warring factions and consolidate power under the umbrella of one powerful royal family line, the Tudors. In order to do this, Margaret Beaufort and Elizabeth agreed that Henry Tudor should marry Elizabeth's eldest daughter, Elizabeth of York, who was, as a result of the death of her brothers, heiress to the House of York. In December 1483, Henry Tudor swore an oath in Brittany, agreeing to the plan. Meanwhile, Richard III had sworn an oath in public that Elizabeth and her daughters were now safe and their position secure, and were therefore allowed to return to the royal fold, seemingly reconciled with the new king for all intents and purposes. As the plotting continued behind the scenes, Henry Tudor, who was in exile in France, made his first attempt to invade England in 1483. However, he was driven back by a storm in the Channel. His second attempt would come 2 years later, when he and his army arrived on the coast of Wales on the 7th of August 1485, travelling inland with increasingly large numbers of followers, joining his army as they marched to London. The invading army was met by Richard and his supporters just south of Market Bosworth in Leicestershire. The conflict which ensued became known as the Battle of Bosworth Field and was one of the most significant in royal history, as it not only ushered in the Tudor dynasty, but also ended the Plantagenet dynasty. The warring factions of Lancaster and York had their final showdown on the 22nd of August, 1485, with a victory cemented by the Lancastrians, ensuring that Henry Tudor, Earl of Richmond, became monarch when his opponent Richard III died on the battlefield. The War of the Roses was finally over, and the victor was subsequently crowned King Henry VII. Very shortly afterwards, he stayed true to his oath and married Elizabeth's daughter, Elizabeth of York. With their alliance securing the fate of both families, Elizabeth's titles were restored, and she was named the Dowager Queen. Whilst her titles had been restored, however, Elizabeth would be forced to acquiesce to the power of Lady Margaret Beaufort. Withdrawing to Bermondsey Abbey, her final 5 years would be spent in relative obscurity, until on the 8th of June 1492 she passed away, and was laid to rest at Windsor Castle alongside her husband, King Edward IV. Elizabeth Woodville lived an eventful life as a young widow who married a king, and in doing so found herself at the centre of an ongoing feud between the houses of York and Lancaster. The War of the Roses defined many key figures in this time, none more so than Elizabeth, who saw her crown taken and then restored, lost her sons to the ambition of Richard III, and was forced to conspire in order to secure her daughter's future as the head of the new Tudor dynasty.